The little girl sat alone in the third pew from the back, and nobody moved toward her. Caleb noticed it the moment he stepped inside the church door, still smelling of horse and field dust because he hadn't had time to change his shirt. He noticed it the way a man notices the thing that will break him open if he lets himself look too long. Rosie had her hands folded in her lap the way he'd taught her, her Sunday ribbon slightly crooked, her boots not quite reaching the floor. The women on her left had shifted a polite inch away. The family on her right had simply left a gap, wide as a wagon rut, and filled their conversation with everything except acknowledgement of the small child sitting quiet as a post between them. He was making his way toward her, past the end of the last pew, when he saw a woman sit down beside Rosie, not across the aisle, not at a cautious remove. Right beside her, close enough that Rosie's small shoulder was almost touching the stranger's arm, and the woman was already leaning in, saying something low and easy, and Rosie was looking up at her the way she looked at the moon sometimes, with that particular stillness that meant the world had just surprised her in a good way. Caleb stopped walking. The woman had dark hair pinned simply, a gray wool dress that had been good once and been cared for since. She wasn't young in the way that draws easy notice, but she was the kind of steady that a man who'd buried a wife and nearly buried himself alongside her could recognize, the kind built by weather and grief and the choice to keep standing anyway. Rosie laughed. It was barely a sound, more breath than anything, but Caleb heard it across the whole of that little church. He sat down on the other side of his daughter and did not look at the woman directly. He didn't have to. He already understood that something had shifted, the way you understand a change in wind before you can name its direction, and he wasn't sure yet whether to be grateful or afraid. He settled on grateful. It was safer. His name was Caleb Marsh, and he was 34 years old, and he had been alone for 2 years in every way that mattered. The woman's name, he would learn during the handshake hour after the sermon, was Grace Hadley. She had been a widow for 11 months. She had arrived in Harlan Crossing, Wyoming, 6 days ago on the Thursday stage, with one trunk and a letter of introduction to the schoolteacher, Mrs. Fenwick, who was her second cousin, and had offered her a room for the winter. 1 room, 11 months a widow, 6 days in a town that didn't know her yet. Caleb filed these facts the way he filed everything, quietly and without comment, but he held on to them. Rosie tugged his sleeve on the walk home and said, "The lady smelled like cinnamon." "Did she?" he said. "She told me my ribbon was pretty." "It is pretty." "She fixed it," Rosie said. "Without asking, she just fixed it." Caleb looked straight ahead at the October road, at the cottonwoods going gold along the creek line, at the particular blue of a Wyoming sky that had never once softened for him. He thought about a woman who would sit down beside a child that everyone else had edged away from. He thought about what that said about a person. He didn't say anything else, but that night, after Rosie was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time with a cold cup of coffee, and he thought about practical things. He had a ranch with more work in it than one man could carry. He had a daughter who needed someone to fix her ribbon without asking. He had a winter coming that the older hands said would be the worst in 20 years. He thought about Grace Hadley, 1 room, 11 months a widow, and a letter introducing her to a woman who could only spare her a room. He told himself he was only thinking practically. He mostly believed it. Caleb went to see Mrs. Fenwick on a Tuesday, hat in hand, which was the only way he knew how to ask for anything. He waited on her porch while she went to fetch Grace, and he stood there looking at the thin smoke coming from the chimney and the early frost on the pumpkins by the step, and he told himself twice more that this was a practical matter and nothing else. Grace came to the door in her work dress, a flower smudge on her wrist, and she looked at him without any particular surprise, as though men showing up at porches with hats in their hands was simply a thing that happened. "Mr. Marsh," she said. "Mrs. Hadley." He turned his hat once. I'll be direct, if you don't mind. I'd prefer it, she said. That steadied him somewhat. He'd rehearsed a long speech, and now found he didn't need most of it. I run the Crosshatch Ranch, 4 miles east. I'm short a housekeeper. I've been short one since spring, and my daughter is eating biscuits I made myself, which is doing neither of us any credit. The position comes with room and board, your own room off the kitchen, a fair wage. I'll write the number down if you want it in writing, and the work is honest. Early mornings, cooking, some mending, keeping the house in order. He paused. Rosie took to you, I noticed. Grace looked at him for a long moment. The October wind moved between them, and she didn't shiver, which he noted. Is that the whole of it? She asked. There's one more thing, he met her eyes. The town will talk. A widow living on a widower's ranch. No relation. I want you to know that going in. Grace was quiet a beat. Mr. Marsh, I buried my husband in Missouri 11 months ago after 3 years of illness. I came to Wyoming with $42 and a letter of introduction. I don't have much room left to be afraid of talk. She looked past him at the frost-edged road. What are the biscuits like? He blinked. Pardon? Your biscuits. Describe them. Flat, he said. Heavy. The kind that discourages hope. The corner of her mouth moved. I'll come Thursday and look at the kitchen. If I think I can work with it, I'll give you my answer then. He nodded, put his hat back on. That's fair. He was 3 steps down the path when she said, Mr. Marsh, the ribbon, Rosie's. She needs 2, so she has a clean one while the other's being washed. He stopped walking. He turned around slowly. I didn't know that. I know you didn't, Grace said. Thursday. She came on Thursday and walked through the kitchen with the particular attention of a woman assessing a situation rather than a room. She opened the flour bin, tested the stove draft, looked at the state of the woodpile through the window, examined the 3 mismatched pots on the shelf, with an expression she kept carefully neutral. Rosie trailed behind her, 2 inches behind her left heel, with the faithful attachment of a child who has decided something and intends to see it through. The stove pulls left, Grace said. I know, Caleb said. You can fix it or I can learn to work around it. I haven't had time to fix it. I'll work around it, she said. For now. She turned and looked at the table, which had 3 chairs, though there had been 4 once. Caleb had moved one to the barn after Ellen died, because 4 chairs at a 3-person table was a kind of grief he couldn't eat breakfast across from every morning. Grace didn't ask about it. She counted the chairs the way she'd counted the pots, with her eyes only, filing the fact away. I'll take the position, she said, but I want the terms in writing as you offered, and I want it understood clearly, between us, that I'm here as your housekeeper, nothing more and nothing less. I won't have confusion about that. Agreed, he said immediately. The wage you mentioned is fair. Good. I'll need Sundays free after the noon meal. Done. Rosie, who had been listening with the focused patience of someone waiting for the important part, looked up at Grace and said, Will you be here when I wake up? Grace looked down at her. Something in her face shifted, something small and careful, like a window opening just a crack. Yes, she said. I'll be here when you wake up. It was, Caleb thought, the most honest promise made in that kitchen since Ellen had been alive to make them. He wrote the terms on paper that evening, and Grace signed her name in a clear, unhurried hand, and that was how Grace Hadley came to the Crosshatch Ranch, one Saturday in October, with 1 trunk and 2 new ribbons she had bought for Rosie out of her first week's pay before she had even earned it. The first 2 weeks were a study in careful distance. They had the terms on paper and they lived by them the way people live by a map in unfamiliar country, grateful for the lines, not yet sure of the territory between them. Grace rose before light and had the stove going by the time Caleb came in from the early check on the livestock. He never spoke much in the mornings, and she seemed to understand this. leaving his coffee at the far end of the table and going about her work without requiring conversation. He found this remarkable. Ellen had been a morning talker, warm and rambling, and he had loved her for it. But grief had made him someone who needed silence before the day asked anything of him, and Grace gave him that without being asked. She was a good cook, which he'd hoped for but hadn't let himself count on. Not fancy. The kitchen was a working ranch kitchen and she treated it as such. But everything she made was warm and solid and tasted like someone had paid attention. The biscuits alone were a kind of small mercy. Rosie ate 2 every morning. What Caleb didn't expect was how Grace was with his daughter in the ordinary minutes. Not dramatic about it, not performing tenderness for his benefit. She simply included Rosie in things, matter-of-factly, the way you include a small person in the life around them, so they understand they belong to it. Rosie stood on a stool and stirred the pot when Grace was making soup. Grace talked while she mended, not down to Rosie, but alongside her, in the easy way of someone who has thought about what it means to be small and unheard. One evening, Caleb came in from a late repair on the fence line and found Rosie asleep in the chair by the stove, and Grace sitting 3 feet away, knitting, and the scene was so ordinary and so full of something he hadn't had for 2 years that he had to stand in the doorway a moment before he could walk through it. "She fell asleep at 6:30, Grace said quietly, not looking up. "I didn't want to move her." "I'll carry her up," he said. "She asked me to read to her first. We got through 2 pages of the primer." A small pause. "She knows her letters better than she lets on. I think she likes being read to so much that she's been careful not to learn too fast." Caleb looked at his sleeping daughter and felt a pang of something that was amusement and sorrow knotted together. "That sounds like Rosie. Clever children do that," Grace said simply. "They find what works." He carried Rosie up to her room and came back down and found Grace had left his supper covered on the back of the stove and gone to her own room without ceremony. He ate alone, which he was used to, but the kitchen was warmer now, physically and otherwise, and the difference sat with him in a way he hadn't braced for. He was not falling in love with Grace Hadley. He was very clear on this point, internally, with some regularity. He was grateful for her. He respected the arrangement. He appreciated what she had done for Rosie and for the functioning of his household. These were sensible, contained things. The trouble was that gratitude in a cold kitchen at the end of a hard day has a way of warming into something harder to name. He didn't examine it. He went to bed and got up before dawn and went on. November came in behind a north wind, and with it, Lester Brand. Brand was the agent for the Territorial Land and Grazing Company, which had been buying up or squeezing out small ranches along the Eastern Creek corridor for 2 years. He came to the crosshatch on a gray Thursday morning in a good coat and bad faith, and Caleb met him on the porch because he had no interest in letting the man inside his house. Brand's pitch was smooth and had been delivered before. The company was offering a fair price. The coming winter would be difficult. Small operations like Caleb's would struggle to hold water rights against the company's senior claims. Better to sell now, take the money, start fresh somewhere more accommodating. "The Crosshatch's water rights predate your company's charter by 6 years, Caleb said. "I filed them myself. I've read the territorial statutes." Brand smiled the smile of a man who is used to people not knowing the law. "Water law is complicated, Mr. Marsh." "It is," Caleb agreed. "I'd suggest you have your company's lawyer look at the filing dates before they get complicated for you." Brand's smile thinned. "The offer stands for 30 days. After that, the company pursues its claims through the territorial court. That kind of legal fight takes money. Money a ranch hand working alone might find difficult to come by." Caleb held the man's gaze steady. "The word you're looking for is rancher, and I've held this land through worse than a company lawyer. Good day, Mr. Marsh." Brand left, and Caleb stood on the porch until the man's horse was out of sight, and then he stayed a moment longer, looking at the brown grass and the fence lines and the bare cottonwoods along his creek, and he felt the weight of it settle on him, the way heavy things do, when there's no one to set half the load on. He went inside. Grace was at the stove. She had clearly heard. The porch wall was thin, and Brand had not been quiet, and she was stirring something with the calm efficiency of a woman processing information while her hands stayed busy. "How old are the filings?" she asked. 1881, he said. "And the company?" "Incorporated in 1887. She nodded once. "Then you're right. But being right costs money to prove in court." "I know." She set the spoon down and turned to face him. "Do you have a lawyer you trust?" "Tom Aldrich in Cheyenne. He drew up the original filing." "Write to him this week," Grace said, "before the 30 days are up. You want a letter in hand before they move." He looked at her for a moment. "You sound like someone who's dealt with this kind of thing." Her face did that small, careful thing again, the window opening a crack. "My husband's land in Missouri. Different company, same coat." She turned back to the stove. "Write to Tom Aldrich." He wrote the letter that evening. What Caleb had not anticipated, and perhaps should have, was that the town of Harlan Crossing had opinions about the arrangement at the Crosshatch Ranch, and not all of them charitable. Mrs. Dunner at the dry goods ran a quiet but thorough operation when it came to community information, and she had let it be known, in her careful way, that a young widow living on a widower's ranch was a situation worth watching. 2 of the churchwomen had stopped greeting Grace after the service. A third, Mrs. Aldford, had asked Grace directly, with a smile like a closed door, how she found the work, with an emphasis that made the question into something else. Grace, to her credit, had said, "Very satisfying, thank you," and moved on. But Caleb knew. He saw it in the half-second before Grace put her expression back in order. He'd seen Ellen face the same kind of thing when they were first married, and she'd come from outside the county, and he'd carried a slow, banked anger about it then, that he felt again now, hotter and less patient, because Grace had done nothing to deserve any of it, and moreover, she was doing him a genuine service, and conducting herself with more dignity than her critics had thought to extend to her. He brought it up on a Saturday evening while Rosie was in bed and the kitchen was quiet. "The talk in town," he said. Grace looked up from the mending. "I know about it. It isn't fair." "No," she agreed. "But I expected it." She set down the shirt. "It doesn't trouble me the way people assume it does. I've been the subject of talk before. You learn to walk through it. It troubles me," he said, "on your behalf." She was quiet a moment. The firelight moved across the kitchen table between them. "That's kind, Mr. Marsh." He looked at his hands. "I've been thinking," he said, and stopped, because the next part required more courage than he usually called on for a conversation. He tried again. "Rosie needs permanence, not a housekeeper who might leave in the spring, not a different woman every season. She's had enough change." Grace was watching him with the patient attention she gave to most things. "And the talk would stop," he said. "Or most of it, if our arrangement were different." "Different," Grace repeated, even-voiced. He met her eyes. "I'm asking you to marry me, Mrs. Hadley. Not, I want to be plain with you, not for the reasons a man usually asks. Not pretending to things I haven't earned the right to yet, but because the arrangement we have is good and honest and it deserves legal standing, and Rosie deserves a mother in fact as well as in practice, and you deserve a home that's yours and not borrowed." He paused. "And because I'd rather face the company's lawyers with a wife beside me than alone." Grace looked at him for a long, unsmiling moment. Not cold, but reading, the way she read the kitchen that first Thursday, taking a full accounting before she committed. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that you are proposing marriage for legal, practical, and parental reasons, and you want me to understand that clearly before I answer?" "Yes," he said. "And you're not asking me to pretend." "I'd never ask you to pretend anything." She was quiet another moment. Then she said, "I will need my own room to remain my own." "Of course. And I want it understood that I'm choosing this, not being rescued, not accepting charity." "Understood." She picked up the mending again. Her hands were steady. "Then yes, Mr. Marsh, I'll marry you." He exhaled, slowly. "Caleb," he said. "You might as well call me Caleb." "Caleb, then." She said his name plainly, as if testing the sound of it. She seemed to find it acceptable. "I'll call you Caleb." The preacher married them on a cold Friday morning in November, with Mrs. Fenwick and old Garrett from the bunkhouse as witnesses. Rosie stood between them at the altar in her best dress with her ribbons straight, because Grace had pinned it herself before they left the house, and when the preacher asked the words and Caleb said them in his low, unhurried voice, Rosie slipped her hand into Grace's and held on, and Grace held on back. There was no party. There was a good dinner at home that evening, the best Grace had yet cooked in that kitchen, with a dried apple cake that Rosie helped frost with clumsy, devoted hands. Caleb ate 2 pieces and said so, because Grace had told him once, lightly, that she cooked better when people said what they thought, and he had taken that seriously, the way he took things. The letter from Tom Aldrich arrived 3 weeks later, confirming what Caleb already knew. The water rights were iron solid, and a second letter, one Caleb had not known about, arrived the same day addressed to the Territorial Land and Grazing Company's registered agent. Grace had written it herself, a week prior, citing the specific statute and filing dates, and suggesting the company's legal position was substantially weaker than their agent had implied, and that she and her husband had retained counsel. She had signed it Grace Marsh. Caleb read both letters standing at the kitchen table with his coat still on. Then he set them down and looked at his wife, who was looking back at him with her measured expression, waiting for his response. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I wanted it sent before I told you, in case you argued." "I would have argued." "I know." She handed him his coffee. "And you would have been wrong." He looked at the letter again. Grace Marsh. The signature had a finality to it, a gravity that turned something over in his chest. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it for more than the letter. Brand did not return. The company withdrew its inquiry before January. December settled over the crosshatch like a hand pressed gently down, quiet and cold and complete. And something in the house settled too. It wasn't the peace of having solved everything. There was still the north pasture fence to reinforce, still the long accounts to balance, still mornings that came too early and days that asked too much. But the particular loneliness that had lived in that kitchen since Ellen died had thinned, pulled out gradually by ordinary things. A second voice in the house, the sound of Rosie laughing at supper, the smell of good bread in the mornings, the presence of someone who stayed. On an evening in late December, Caleb came in from the barn and found that the 4th chair had appeared at the kitchen table. Not the one from the barn. He had not moved that one. A new chair, plain, smooth, and finished, with a woven seat, placed at the 4th side of the table as though it had always been there. He stood looking at it. Grace came in from the back room and saw him looking and said nothing, the way she said nothing about the things she understood. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "Garrett made it. I asked him to." She set down the pan she was carrying. "A table needs 4 chairs, Caleb." He looked at the chair for another moment. Then he pulled it out and sat in it. It was solid and well made, and it fit the table exactly right. He ran his thumb along the armrest. Grace sat down across from him, which she had started doing in the evenings, just the two of them after Rosie was in bed, not always talking, sometimes just present in the same warm room. "I'm glad you came to sit with Rosie," he said. "That Sunday. Everyone else," he stopped. "I know what everyone else did," she said. I was on my way to her. I know that too. She folded her hands on the table. But I got there first. He looked at her. The lamp between them made the kitchen glow the color of old gold, and outside the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like the world breathing, and Caleb Marsh understood, without ceremony and without pretense, that the thing he had been telling himself he was not feeling had been there for some time, growing in the space between gratitude and something truer. He said, "Grace." She said, "Yes." Just that. But she met his eyes without looking away, and something passed between them that did not require more words than that. Not yet. Not on a cold December night, when the house was warm, and they had only just found their footing. There was time. There was the whole of winter ahead, and spring behind that, and a life that was building itself chair by chair, meal by meal, in the honest and unhurried way that things built to last are always built. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held on, the same as Rosie had held on at the altar, with the same quiet conviction, and Caleb Marsh, who had been alone for 2 years in every way that mattered, was not alone anymore. There is something the old settlers knew, that we have perhaps let ourselves forget. A home is not built out of want, it is built out of willingness. The willingness to sit beside a stranger's child when no one else will. The willingness to walk into an unfamiliar kitchen and make it work. The willingness to sign your name to a life even when the terms are uncertain and the future is cold. Grace and Caleb built their life from honest work and plain words and one chair at a time, and what they built held, because what is made by two people choosing each other freely, in full knowledge of each other's weight, is made to hold. If this story stirred something in you, leave a comment below and tell us, was it Grace sitting down beside Rosie, or Caleb covering her hand at the table, that settled in your heart? We would love to hear from you. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do, because there are more stories of love and courage on the frontier waiting right here for you, every week. Good night. God bless you, and God bless the homes you are building.